10:15 on a Sunday morning presenting adaptation methodologies. It doesn't feel for me, but we'll manage. So thanks very much for making the effort to come. And we're going to spend the next hour and a half looking at how we quantify adaptation, which I think has been quite a difficult challenge for many to get their heads around. And I think it's one of the reasons why we haven't seen a lot of finance going into adaptation, because it struggles with quantification compared to the ease with which we can quantify greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation activities. So I think it's a really important subject, and it's great that we've got a panel here today. We're a little bit down on numbers from our panelists, but it's great that we've got this event to explore this further. So I'd like to thank ICD, our Taiwanese colleagues, for hosting us. It's great to have a space, and again, thank you for coming. Now, my name is Gareth Phillips. I'm the manager of climate and environmental finance at the African Development Bank, and I've been working in this climate change space for a long time now. I used to do a lot more on the mitigation side, but actually I think adaptation is becoming increasingly important, and I really see that addressing the challenges of adaptation is really the elephant in the room, because although we have to spend a lot of money on mitigation, I think that there will come a time when we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and that we potentially shut down the last coal-fired power plant. But by that time, the demand for adaptation finance is going to be huge, because every day we're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and every day the climate is changing more, and that means more and more people are going to need more support to adapt to climate change. So I think finding ways to finance adaptation is going to be increasingly important, and key to that is how we quantify and measure adaptation. So we're going to have a couple of presentations. I'm going to do an introductory welcoming presentation to open the subject. Then we'll have two presentations, and then I'll actually make a third presentation instead of Axel Mikalova, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So the subject today is methodologies for quantifying adaptation action. And as I said, I think the challenge for adaptation is that we don't have clear metrics. We know that adaptation is highly context and technology specific. So what works to help people adapt in one area isn't exactly what's required to help people adapt in another area. And this makes it very difficult to finance. When you look at the mobilizing climate finance, when you look at the direction of flow, for example, at the Green Climate Fund, and amongst the MDBs, it's all about scaling up. It's about programmatic activities. We want initiatives that mobilize $50, $100 million at a time, and so on. Not $5 or $10 million projects. But when you look at adaptation activities, working with this farming community or these fisher folk, or addressing the adaptation needs for accessing potable water for this village, the levels of funding that we're looking for are so much smaller, and this makes it very challenging to mobilize finance for adaptation. And therefore, it's very important that we find ways to move this forward. Now, efforts to date have tended to focus on, well, there's maybe two different approaches. One is coming up with a kind of effort to create an adaptation unit or a credit, some sort of single measure of adaptation. And for example, you might have heard of DAILYs, the Daily Adjusted Life, and I can never remember the acronym, but anyway, it has a complex weighting methodology, and there's lots of these examples of tools that weight different elements, and they're all very good, but as soon as you get into weighting, it becomes subjective, it becomes complex, and you have to justify why you're saying, oh, 50% for this parameter, 20% for that, and people want to change it and so on. So I find these, these sort of tools for trying to bring a whole load of things together, I find those difficult to justify. And the alternative approach is that you choose one metric that you then focus on. And one, for example, that the Green Climate Fund uses is the number of people who benefit. And this is fine. I mean, certainly the number of people who benefit from an adaptation activity is very important. But whenever you choose a parameter like this, you inadvertently create bias to push project developers and technologies into a particular area. And so the example I like to say, kind of because it rhymes, is it's great if you're doing an adaptation project in Bali, but it's really difficult in Mali, because the population density is so different, So if you want to do the maximum number of people, Go to somewhere like Rwanda or Bali, and you'll capture loads of people in a small project area. And, that's great, but everybody has the right to assistance to adapt to climate change. And so we don't want to create these kind of perverse incentives that push us in different directions. And so I think for me, the direction that we need to go on defining adaptation is to start from a bottom-up approach and to say to countries that it's their prerogative to say what their adaptation needs are. It's not the global north's job to say, okay, we're going to, choose these technologies or these metrics. It should be the other way around. Countries should say, this is the help that we need. These are the targets that we set, and we need your support to meet those targets. And actually, the Paris Agreement provides a framework for doing that. We have the national adaptation plans or nationally determined contributions as places where parties are invited to communicate the things that they need support for to help them on their pathway to low carbon climate resilient development. And we have the enhanced transparency framework where contributors, where donor countries have the opportunity to declare the support that has been received. And so with those two instruments, I think we have an opportunity for developing countries to say, right, we have 30,000 farmers in this region who need to transition to climate resilient agriculture by 2030, or they're going to become food insecure. And that's going to trigger all kinds of problems, migration, radicalization, collapse of their ecosystems, and so on. So we need help to do that. And they can put that in their NDC or their national adaptation plan. And then a developed country can come and say, okay, we want to help those people. And then all we need to do is to find a way that we can mobilize support to do that, and a way to monitor and report the outcomes or the impacts that show that we have delivered support to help those people transition to climate resilient agriculture. And I think that when we hear from Haruna and Sophie in their presentations, we're going to see some indications of how we might measure those activities and report them and so on. And certainly I'll then give a presentation that will speak to those topics. Now, the other thing that I think is interesting is that when we come to quantify or to report adaptation, we don't have targets for this, and therefore we're reporting information through the enhanced transparency framework. And that process, I think, can be a lot easier and a lot more flexible compared to reporting greenhouse gas emissions under Article 6.2 or 6.4. And so I think there is an opportunity when we look at developing adaptation projects to negotiate between the host country and the project developer and anybody who's going to give support for that to agree what it is that we want to support. So, for example, we'll look at this and I'll give a presentation that will look at the theory of change. And the theory of change, as you may know, it identifies inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And when you have a strong theory of change, so when you're very confident that the inputs will lead to the outputs and the outputs lead to the outcomes, and if you get to the outcomes, you're highly likely to get to the impacts. There's flexibility there to then choose what it is that you're going to monitor. And there's an opportunity to choose monitoring methodologies that are cheap and easy to monitor and that you can monitor early on in the project cycle. So if you can monitor the results from outputs and outcomes that you're confident that will yield to impacts, or that will result in impacts, then you can accelerate the project cycle. You can pay for the delivery of outcomes or outputs that you know will yield the impacts in the future. And you don't have to wait, because impacts typically, it can be 10 years before you see the impacts. And we can't wait 10 years to fund these projects and move on to the next one. So what I'm trying to say is I think that monitoring and reporting adaptation offers us a lot of flexibility to choose cheap, simple, easy, quick ways to deliver what we think is adequate to lead to adaptation in the longer term. And that's important because it means we can accelerate the project cycle. The financing costs go down, the risks go down, and the rate at which we can implement projects goes up. And I'll talk a bit more about that when I come to my presentation to make that point further. The last point I want to make is that I think there's also an opportunity to raise more finance for adaptation in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals and corporate social responsibility initiatives that we see being undertaken. We know that we're behind on the achievement of the SDGs. The 2023 SDG report said that we were well behind on more than 50% of the targets, and some were even slipping backwards. So we need more support for the Sustainable Development Goals. We need more input from corporate social responsibility actors. And I think that adaptation touches on many of the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's an opportunity there to link adaptation, the Sustainable Development Goals, and corporate social responsibility, and try to get more corporate finance coming in to support these activities. And one of the examples which I'm not going to go into detail in the methodology, but we have a methodology in Cote d'Ivoire that's looking at climate resilient cocoa that ICRAF are developing for us. And that methodology will touch on SDG 1, no poverty, 2, zero hunger, 5, gender equality, 8, decent work and economic growth, 13, climate action, and 15, life on land. So that one methodology can hit 6 SDG targets. And I'm sure if we start to look more at adaptation and identify the links to the Sustainable Development Goals, then it will provide opportunities to promote and find new sources of finance to trigger more adaptation work. And I know there's other groups are working on these links between the SDGs and adaptation, and I think it's an area that we can do more to expand upon and help to try to achieve the SDG goals by 2030, as well as addressing adaptation and reporting all of that through the enhanced transparency framework. So let me stop there with my sort of introductory presentation, and I'm going to call now on Haruna to come and give her first presentation. Let me just try and get the slides up. And you can come and stand here, Haruna, and I will take your seat. Let's just get that to there. Okay, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Haruna Yoshizawa from METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Thank you. Thank you very much. So my ministry is from Ministry of Industry. So we see this adaptation as a chance for the companies to get some business as well. So we are trying to promote Japanese companies who have the adaptation solvent technologies. But as Gareth has explained, adaptation business is very difficult to monetize. So we provided some guidance for the companies to on how to visualize the contribution of adaptation business. So I'm just gonna explain some what's inside this guidance. So these are the steps to how to visualize the contribution of the adaptation business. So this is not an official guidance, but it's just we did some research on from the internet base and integrated to one guidance book. So these are the steps. So first, we think that we should identify a target project for visualization. It shouldn't be a company based, but it should be a project based, so it's easier to quantify. And then we have to put a logic setting. So the logic setting is the inputs, outputs, and the outcomes. So you can see from the table 2 that for the inputs, it's the peoples and the goods and the monies you input, and then the output will be the goods and services provided through the inputs, and the outcomes is the effects and the changes, the impacts. So in order to measure the outcomes, we need an indicator, a specific indicator. So for step 3, you have to set the indicator. And for this indicator, there's no like a universal common indicator. So that is the difficult part, and we also have to use indicators that it's measurable and things that you can collect the data from. So, okay. And then for step 4, collect the data according to the indicator. And for step 3, you analyze the data like before and after. You analyze the numbers before and after, and then you can evaluate the impact of this adaptation business. And then you can use the results to inform it to the investors and the stakeholders, and maybe get some feedbacks from them to improve the get some feedbacks on what, like if the necessary indicators should be this one or that one or things like that. So I've using this steps, I apply this to some specific case studies. We have in for Japanese companies. So this is a case study in Uganda. So Uganda have a real problem of the scarcity of a safe drinking water, getting enough safe drinking water due to climate change of droughts and floods. So what they do is they're making a lot of boreholes, hand pumps in the village. But the problem is that they do set the borehole hand pumps, but they don't. It's very difficult to collect the fees from the residents because what they do is that they collect some equal amount of fees from each residence. So the people feel that it's a little unfair to pay the fee because, like, no matter the fee isn't accordingly to the amount of water they use. So they tend to reject to pay the fee. So you can't get the maintenance fee. So once the borehole wells are broken, you can't. There's no maintenance fee, so you can't repair it. So it stays broken. So about 30% of the boreholes are said to be broken. So and then if the boreholes are broken, people have to move to other villages to get drinking water. So that is also a little cost. So to tackle this issue, this is a Japanese startup company called Sunda Technology Global. It developed a technology called pay-as-you-fetch fee collection system. So this system, they provide an ID tag to the residents of the users of the borehole water users, and then to this ID tag, they can use their mobile financing to prepay the money to this ID tag, and then there's a system on the boreholes that you can just like tap it, and then it charges you the money accordingly to the amount of water that you get. So this technology is very fair because the fee is depends on the amount of water they get, and it's very transparent, and it's very sustainable because they can collect the fees, so they can use the fees to maintenance the broken boreholes. So I have applied the steps of this project, the steps to this project. So the input for this project will be the human resources, setting the system to the boreholes, and then some money for the system and the system itself. And the output will be the installation of the boreholes with the system So the outcome, there is a short-term outcome and a long-term outcome. And for the short-term outcome, it will be the increased number of boreholes with the system and the number of users. And it's also the ensuring the sustainable maintenance system for maintenance system. And for the long-term outcomes, it will be the increased population with the access to water from the boreholes, and also the widespread of sustainably available, so unbroken, widespread use of unbroken boreholes. So for these outcomes, we have used some indicators, which is the number of the boreholes with the system and the number of users, and also the cost of the maintenance, I mean the collection of the maintenance fee, and also the annual occupancy rate. So this is the impact evaluation. So for each of the indicators, we see the before and after numbers. So each of the indicators, for each of the indicators, you can see that the numbers increase. So you can visualize that this technology contributes to this contributes to the society. So for example, the first one, number of boreholes that is in operation have increased by 36%, 63%, and also the number of users and the collection of the maintenance fee and the annual operation occupancy rate has all increased. So this is an example of how you can visualize the contribution of adaptation business. Okay, that would be, yes, that'll be all for my presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Before we move on to the second presentation, questions for clarification? Yes, but not for discussion. Clarification, and I'll be
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Now that that's working, okay. So we'll have that next time. So I'm going to tee up the next presentation, which is from Sophie de Koning from UN Climate Development, CDF, Capital Development Fund. All right, now yours are on a PDF format, so hang on, let me just make that a little bit smaller. Okay, Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gareth. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and to present the work that we do on local adaptation across countries. And we do work in Uganda, so I already see linkages there. So that's very good. So it's an initiative from the UN Capital Development Fund to help finance what is now called locally led adaptation, working with local government. I explain what it is. You see here the different partners across the world that are, supporting. So mostly through bilateral aid so far from these various partners, including with the African Development Bank in 2 countries in Africa. So the initiative is called Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. Sorry, I'll just. Okay, I need to. Right. So essentially, what so UNCDF is working across various types of financial instruments and mostly with least developed countries, but also other countries, small island developing states and African nations. And we do help countries put in place, and that will link to the quantifying very soon, put in place a financing mechanism for local adaptation. So essentially, we help the countries create a grant window into their transfer systems to local governments, which is coming in addition to other grant transfers that they get. And it's a way to help localize the nationally determined contribution or the national adaptation plan working through, their own systems. So we do work with ministries of finance, ministries in charge of climate change, ministries in charge of local governments and other organizations at the central level to put in place this architecture, if you want. And then we do help them access different type of finance. Mostly we start with bilateral aid, which is still the biggest source of climate finance if we look at the BA report. And then also we do help them access, for example, Green Climate Fund or Adaptation Fund. So the grant window is this blue box. It's a bit small, but this performance-based climate resilience grant, you see this little euro there, it goes to the local government, and then they can program that grant according to their local risks. So they can decide to invest in agriculture if it fits the NDC and their mandate and their local priorities. They do invest a lot in water, and we do see in the portfolio a lot of boreholes, which don't have the pay as you fetch solution. So maybe we'll look at that. And they also do work across sectors. So what is particular is that they can access the grants as they meet certain minimum conditions. So that is a checkpoint, but they also invited to work towards certain performance measures. So every year, each local government, and at this point we have worked with up to 350 local governments. It's still small, but across 20 countries. On average, about 100 investment per country so far. I'll show you the map, but it means every year there is neutral assessment going to the local governments and looking at how they did according to a range of indicators. So that's one way to measure how they're doing in terms of adaptation. We do also monitor, and I'll come to that, the type of investment that they decide. So we do have for now perhaps 2,000 investments, about 18 in Uganda, if we take that case. And so we can look at that database from different angles. I'll explain how they have to justify those investments. But essentially, as they get better scores, they get a bigger grant. So we compare them with one another, and it's creating an incentive for them to improve, and they can invest, according to their local risk together with, communities. So that's a bit how it works. Now, in terms of the adaptation quantification or measurement. So we have worked with the World Resource Institute to develop a framework that we call Assessing Climate Change Adaptation Framework, whereby when a local government receives a grant, they are invited to understand their risks, and there is work to do to actually equip them with climate information that is, scientific, which they can also use with their local knowledge. And each investment then has to be justified with a small adaptation rationale, explaining how, let's say, that borehole will address certain risks, or how if they plant trees, it's going to around a riverbank, it's going to help with certain floods. So they have to really justify each investment with an adaptation rationale. Each investment, and we're talking here about, small scale investment, the size of the grant varies from $50,000 per local government per year to perhaps, up to $300,000 per local government per year, depending on the size of those local governments and the country. So as they justify, you mentioned the outcome, we don't either have a list of outcome indicators. It was, discussed at length with WRI, and the decision was that the outcome indicators, they craft based on their situation. What is common to them is that the adaptation action will be classified according to whether they are climate specific, climate smart, climate strategic, and so on, so that we get a sense of, in a way, the climate intensity, whether it's more justified from a development perspective with, embedding adaptation, or whether it's really 100% justified because of adaptation, and that investment wouldn't take place if it wasn't for climate change. So that gives a sense of, the intensity, and you could imagine that then you could also, assign a percentage of the finance that then is really climate or not. So we do also, like you mentioned, we look at the population in the districts where we work. That gives us the indirect beneficiaries. But so far, we haven't felt it influence where we're going. And we do also try to track the direct beneficiaries. So back to investment, they also are classified according to the sector. So that can be also useful to try to make the link with the SDGs, like Garrett was saying. We look at the ecosystems. Recently, we started tagging all of them according to whether they embed sustainable natural resource management and nature-based solution. We found over a portfolio of 1,000 investment across 10 countries that roughly, without pushing it, 35% already address sustainable natural resource management. And they also have output indicators. So that's where with those output indicators, we can aggregate at a country level or at a regional level or at global level. So that's, so we do, to sum up, we do measure the finance that flows, the indirect beneficiaries, the direct beneficiaries, those investments that can then be classified, according to, various dimensions, including sectors, SDGs, nature, and the kind of intensity, the type of adaptation action in terms of where they come from, be it more or less justified from a climate perspective. So now this particular instrument, financing instrument, but also planning instrument is rolled out at the demand of countries. Currently, we work with 38 countries. About 20 have activated the system with grants that we have helped mobilize, and the others, they are preparing, meaning crafting what you saw on the first visual, but also those indicators that the local governments will be assessed against, which can also give valuable information in terms of how they are improving themselves on integrating climate information, but also eventually influencing how they use the other resources that they have, which are originally not climate finance per se, but development finance perhaps. So the countries go through various phases. First, we help them design. All the countries in blue are preparing. Then they start putting, or we help them access finance to start putting funding into the pipe, going to the local level and investing. Those are the countries in green, phase 1. Then they move to phase 2. Phase 2 is already a bigger footprint. So, for example, if we take Bangladesh, it went up to 72 union parishad, still a drop in the ocean because there are over 4,000, but already running at a larger scale. The Gambia, 32 wards, etc. And then they move to what we call phase 3, when it's becoming, well, depending on the criteria, really a national program. In Mozambique, it's become a program that the president is supporting, 40 districts, all bilateral aid, but a big footprint. Bhutan has scaled up with budget support of the EU to 100 gigawatts, so half the country. So it becomes really, a bigger operation that the government is really leading, and where UNCDF has is stepping on the side rather to help mostly than to help implement. So that's a model for countries to then go to, of course, bilateral, to go to Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, I mentioned, and Benin has just, also with support from African Development Bank, they just accessed the Green Climate Fund last month, which means that this methodology is also holding the scrutiny of the climate funds, and we know it can be difficult for countries to access. And we also see interest from a number of multilateral development banks to use the same instruments, because it's an instrument that is derived from decentralization, which they, for many of them, they are quite used to finance. Now back to the negotiation. So we also work with the countries to develop an ISO standard. So that's another way to somehow ensure that there is compliance with a certain methodology. And it's also been, presented, by us as observer or by the countries themselves in various, bodies of the UNFCCC, including presented like the ABM as a non-market approach, which can then, also help facilitate the demand and the supply of support. We hope for the countries to continue this kind of work. So I'll stop here. Happy to further exchange on the details in case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Round of applause. And so any questions for clarification? Okay, so we'll jump to the final presentation, and then we'll come and carry on with the discussion. So thank you very much, Sophie. Now, sorry, I prepared this presentation over breakfast this morning, so it was hastily done, and the formatting is not very good. I apologize for the colors, as you'll see in a minute. So I really wanted to focus on this use of the theory of change, which was the logic model that Haruna mentioned, and this input outputs and outcomes impacts, and the choice of indicators, the flexibility that we have to choose indicators that are cheap and easy. And I think this is a very interesting area to explore further. So first of all, I'm talking here about this mechanism called the adaptation benefits mechanism, which is the tool that we're establishing at the African Development Bank under Article 6.8. We hope it will be registered there alongside local on as a non-market approach. And the idea is that we generate certified adaptation benefits that are for sale to corporates, to governments, and to philanthropies. And selling those certified adaptation benefits provides a cash flow to adaptation project developers, and that cash flow enables them to borrow money to build the project. So we're trying to solve this problem of the fact that we don't get private sector investment into adaptation projects because they can't access debt capital markets to borrow money. So by providing that cash flow, we try to do that. So we've developed guidelines for our methodology, and I'll not go through all these in great detail, but these are the main headings that we see. Actually, the project typology comes first. So Sophie had a list of different types of climate actions, adaptation actions. We have a slightly different table, but a way of trying to classify adaptation activities. And then the second point, although it's first here on my slide, is establishing this climate rationale, which is very important to do. And for example, in the Sunda technology for the water pumps, the challenge is how to distinguish these kinds of activities from just regular development, because providing clean drinking water is also a development activity. So it's very important, if we want to present these as adaptation activities, to understand what the underlying situation is. And so, for example, in a water pump situation, you need to be able to demonstrate that traditional sources or historic sources of water are drying up, for example. So for 3 months of the year, they're no longer viable, or the quality of water has decreased. And as a result of that, and that may be because of changing rainfall patterns or changing vegetation. That means that water is no longer infiltrating into the soil and is not permeating out, and so on. So those sources of water are going, and that's a result of climate change. And this project is trying to address that. So you need to establish this climate rationale, and the 3 steps that we have in the MDBs, the multilateral development banks. First of all, you have to establish the climate change vulnerability. So this is, say, the climate is changing and it's impacting the way that people are living. And typically, for example, we see that the impact is on women and girls. Their drudgery tasks are getting harder. They're spending more time fetching water, more time collecting firewood, because the resources are being depleted, and climate change is impacting upon that. Then you have to explain how the activity is addressing the climate change vulnerability. So what is your solution, and how do you know it's going to make it better? And then you need to demonstrate how the activity increases the adaptive capacity and resilience. And in the case of the water pumps, when you free up women's time and girls' time, you enable them to be more economically productive. Typically, women will spend more time on agricultural productivity and with post-harvest processing, adding value to their products. And that makes the household economically stronger. And when the household is economically stronger, they're in a better position to respond to disaster, and particularly climate disaster, but also other disasters that, like COVID or other sorts of impacts, but particularly climate disaster. And for girls, you free up their time, you enable them to be more involved in education. And we know that if you educate girls more, then they go on to have a better, more productive life. And so it's a virtual circle. So that's an example of the climate rationale. We have things like eligibility criteria to help define, who, how and where you apply the project. You have to establish the baseline, and we had a very nice table from Haruna showing the baseline for the number of pumps, and then the project scenario with the number of pumps. A really nice example there. We look for a definition of the adaptation benefits, and this goes back to the point about them being context specific, so and technology specific. So if you're doing climate resilient agriculture, it might be hectares of farmland under climate resilient agriculture, or it might be households practicing climate resilient agriculture. If you're doing mangroves for coastal protection, it might be kilometers of coastline protected, or it could be hectares of coastline or of plantation, and so on. So lots of flexibility. Then we have the demonstration that the business is not, the activity is not business as usual. So we need to make sure that this is additional. And again, in Haruna's example, the problem there is there's a barrier because they're not able to collect the money. And, even though people may be willing to pay, it's unfair. And so they're not able to collect the money. And the result is the pumps become, they fall into disrepair and there's no money to fix them. So there is a barrier that needs to be overcome. And that's how we demonstrate that it's not business as usual. Now, interestingly, in our with the adaptation benefits mechanism, we want to know about the duration of what we call the benefiting period. And for those of you familiar with the carbon markets, you'll know that we have this concept of a crediting period in the carbon markets, which is, and now it's possibly linked to the duration of the NDC or the next NDC, or under 6.4, I think it's now 5 or 10 years renewable. In the days of the clean development mechanism, it was 7 years renewable twice, or 10 years, and so on. This concept of the crediting period is actually quite arbitrary because it has no relation to the technology or the rate at which the project pays off. In the adaptation space, because it's a non-market mechanism, what we say is that you can generate adaptation benefits for as long as you need to mobilize money to make the project sustainable. But once you've got enough money to pay off the initial investment or to overcome the barrier, then we don't issue any more adaptation benefits. So we're very interested in the analysis of the duration of the benefiting period and the amount of money that you need to raise through the sale of the adaptation benefits to overcome the financial barrier. So that's something we look for. We need to know about how you're treating greenhouse gas emissions and emission reductions, because many of these projects have mitigation co-benefits. And it's fine to identify those, but I think the parties had agreed that you either monetize the adaptation or you monetize the mitigation, but you shouldn't monetize both because you're effectively getting paid twice for doing the same thing. So we need to know about that. And then we need an MRV procedure. So those are some of the aspects that we look for in an adaptation benefit mechanism methodology. Now, I'm going to look very briefly at some high-level theories of change for some different technologies that we might see coming through adaptation benefit projects. And this is, sorry, the formatting on the coloring isn't very nice. So I've got 4 examples. These are very high level, and they're designed to provide guidance for developers that want to take forward a project, and then they would need to put more detail into this. But I thought it was interesting to look at this. So this is the first example is looking to raise revenues through the sale of adaptation benefits to pay for conservation of biodiversity in protected areas. And actually, this is a really interesting example because traditionally, the way we would address this is through avoided deforestation, and we would try to monetize the carbon and sell the carbon credits. But I think it can also be very interesting to look at this from an adaptation point of view, on the basis that adaptation is biodiversity is nature's means of adapting to climate change. If we lose our biodiversity in our national parks and forests and so on, then in 100 years' time, when we're looking at 3 degrees, then there's going to be no biodiversity to respond to that. And we know that, evolution doesn't work on the timescale of 100 years. Evolution works in thousands, tens of thousands of years. So we need to protect these resources of biodiversity to enable us to adapt to climate change, to enable nature to adapt. So I think this is a really interesting area. So if we start down, so the situation is you have a national park, and they don't have any revenues to protect the national park. They can't protect the boundaries, they can't stop the poaching and the illegal logging because they've got no revenues. So what do? So we want to create an adaptation benefit project that provides revenue through the sales of adaptation benefits. And this is the theory of change that would help us establish this. So we see the inputs. First of all, we need to secure the rights to the land. So that might be, sort of a single large payment effectively to the government, to encourage them or to require them to create the reserve in the Constitution, so that it becomes some land that is protected in the long term, that can't then be exploited. So we might need to pay them to do that. And the example here I'm giving is, we know that in DRC, the government is interested in auctioning the exploration rights for oil and gas in blocks of forest. And they're expecting to raise, I understand, about $400 million from that process. So if we could raise some money, we might be able to buy some of those rights. And instead of them being sent for oil and gas prospecting, we would say, okay, we want that money now locked up. So we want that land locked up in the Constitution as a national reserve. And here's the money to compensate the government for doing that. So we need some money to secure the land rights. We need some money and knowledge to develop a biodiversity management plan. We need some capacity to implement the plan, and we need some scientific studies. So those are the inputs. The outputs are the legal right to all the beneficial aspects of the land. So it needs to be locked up so that it can't be sold on to somebody else in the future. We need a management plan. We need to implement the actions on the ground. So that's things like protecting the boundaries, putting in monitoring systems, working with the local communities and so on, so that they can continue to live and practice their normal activities. And we also get knowledge and information on biodiversity coming out of the scientific studies. So those are the outputs. Then the outcomes, first of all, we have the long-term or in perpetuity protection of the forest. We have annual reports and periodic updates coming from the management plans. We have MRV studies, and we start to see the long-term value of biodiversity. And then the long-term impact over 10, 20, 50 years is we have the conservation of biodiversity for future generations and enabling nature to adapt to climate change. So that's sort of the context of the theory of change. Now, within that, we need to then identify indicators that are cheap and easy, ideally cheap and easy to monitor, that would enable us to prove to our donors or the people who are buying the adaptation benefits that this program is in place. And so you might think these days we might be able to use technology to monitor the boundaries of the national parks. We might be able to put in on the gates, we might be able to have cameras that are filming all the time, just tracking what's happening. So we can always see if there's a lorry coming out with logs on it, then we know we've got a problem. We might be able to put some monitoring devices in areas of the national park. I'm very interested to explore further monitoring of bird song. I don't know if there's any bird watchers here, but now you get these apps that pick up bird song and they tell you what species are, and that really helps you identify what you're looking at. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to use that technology to simply monitor, record what biodiversity is present in the forest. And actually you could now do that on thousands of sampling points throughout the forest, and you could monitor the change. And that's a cheap and easy way of demonstrating that the biodiversity continues to be protected. And there could be areas where you're helping to restore biodiversity, and you could start to see increase in species. In the UK, there's also a research group who are looking at putting microphones in the soil to monitor the sounds of worms and nematodes to detect soil health. So you could do the same thing in these things to check that your biodiversity isn't being degraded. So I think there's lots of really interesting ways we could use technology that could give us a cheap and easy confirmation that we are protecting the biodiversity in this area, which can then trigger the payments for adaptation benefits, which then come back to supporting the ongoing management of the park. So that's the first example. So the others aren't quite so long, don't worry. Next one is looking at the installation of wastewater and wastewater treatment as a service. So we know that in some countries, and in fact, here is also a good example. They don't have the agriculture. I'm thinking more maybe of some areas in Egypt where they have a lot of housing developments, tourism developments, so very intensive use of water, a huge amount of wastewater created from sewage that has to be treated somehow, but the government doesn't have the money to put the treatment facilities in place, and typically it's being half treated or released into the sea or whatever, which isn't a good result. So the problem is that the opportunity is to look at the treatment of the wastewater to create water for irrigation that becomes an adaptation technology for farmers. And so there's an opportunity to raise revenues from the treatment of water and selling that to farmers for irrigation, but the revenues that you generate from selling the water isn't going to be enough to build the treatment facility. So you're going to need an injection of capital up front, and we think that we could use the adaptation benefits mechanism to sell adaptation benefits that would pay for the construction of the treatment facility, which then proceeds to take the wastewater from the tourism industries and clean it up and use it for irrigation to help the farmers become more resilient, and then they can sell the products back to the hotels and so on. So you get a nice little system working there. So that's another example. My third example is clean cooking. Clean cooking is very interesting. Again, we typically view that as a mitigation technology, but actually for the women and girls who are involved in collecting firewood and cooking on the stoves and so on, it's much more than a mitigation technology. They don't care two hoots about greenhouse gas emissions. What it impacts is their time management and their health. So in a situation where you have the climate rationale, so you need to be able to demonstrate that accessing fuel wood is becoming harder because of climate change, relying on fossil fuel sources of energy is becoming harder because of supply chain issues, because the weather is disrupting their ability to get to be able to afford fossil fuels. And that's a real situation in SIDS, in small island developing states, for example, where they have to transport all of the fuel in. That can become an issue when the weather is becoming more extreme and so on. So there are situations where you can make the case that cooking energy is struggling or is being impacted by climate change. Then you can use the revenues from the sale of adaptation benefits to subsidize the clean cooking technologies. And this has major benefits on women's time management, enabling them to be more productive, economically and agriculturally productive, enabling them to then become more resilient to climate change. So I think that's a nice example. And then the last one is the irrigation of cacao plantations. This is also similar to the agroforestry methodology that I mentioned in my earlier introduction. So it's the same sort of situation where you can implement a technology that improves productivity, that makes the households more climate resilient because they've got more revenues. And we can mobilize money to pay for the implementation of these technologies through the sale of adaptation benefits in the first instance. So that's sort of concludes my slides. I think I'd just like to summarize by saying that all of these sort of very basic theories of change provide us with the opportunity to identify cheap and easy indicators to monitor. And I'll come back to Haruna's example because I think it was really nice. If you can use, so the farmers, the households were paying for their money through mobile money transfers. Now, if you can access the information on those mobile money transfers, you can just, I mean, it's just an electronic process to identify the uptake of this technology. You can see how many transactions have taken place, and you can very quickly establish whether people are using this technology or not, because if they're paying for it, it's safe to assume they're using it. They're not going to pay for it if they're not using it. So you've got a very cheap and easy way of establishing how much your technology is being used. And you saw in the example there, it gave a sort of a very clear indication of the WITH project and the baseline scenario, the benefits. So I think we have this opportunity to identify indicators that help us demonstrate that adaptation is taking place. And I go back to the point, I don't think I made it very well in my introduction, but we want to use this information to report voluntary contributions towards adaptation support in developing countries. And in that instance, that information, that the cheap and easily verified information may well be acceptable to both the donors and the host country as evidence. And it's not like the carbon markets where you have to do a huge amount of effort to monitor, to certify the tons of carbon. And so I think we have an opportunity with adaptation to come up with much cheaper and easier ways of defining what it is that we're delivering. So with that, I'm going to ask Sophie and Haruna to come and take the seats at the front. I'm going to switch my presentation off. Let's see if we can go back to our cover slide. And I'm going to open the floor up for questions. So, and I've got a little microphone here, which I'm going to turn on. Good. And I'm sorry about this. We were laughing about this. This is a very Americanized title. We're quantifying adaptation benefits. But I'm sorry, it's PDF, so I couldn't change it easily. Right. So we're open for questions. I know you had one, Raphael. Why don't you kick us off?
Great. I just have a question to Haruna. Yeah, Haruna. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I was just wondering regarding the issue of integrating the climate rationale and climate risks in the framework that you showed to us. How do you integrate climate risks to really show that the activities are really addressing those climate risks in the framework that you showed us?
Yeah.
So clarifying your question, so how the climate risk is integrated into this. So let's see. So these the steps that I mentioned is just to visualize, quantify the effects, the impacts for using these technologies. And I don't know how it's integrated, but maybe like according to the climate, the before and after numbers might be changing, but so this, I'm sorry. So this is adaptation technology. So it's for the climate risk. So it's to prevent the it's to adapt to the climate risk. So so this technology itself, I think, integrates the climate risk. So I don't know.
Maybe I can add a little bit, because I think also wasn't addressed in your presentation was the climate rationale. So you have here a technology that could just be presented as a development technology, as a way of helping village water committees raise revenue to maintain the pump. But I think that you need to put it into a context of where water supplies are becoming more scarce because of changing climate, to establish the climate rationale and to say this is now a climate change project, a climate adaptation project, and not just a development project. So I think that element wasn't covered in your presentation. But to mobilize adaptation finance, it would need to add that into the project document.
Maybe my adaptation story wasn't clear enough, but so in Uganda, there's a severe climate change for more floods and droughts. So we need this technology to provide them the sustainable, safe drinking water. So that's the adaptation story.
We had another example in Madagascar, where they're suffering increasingly from typhoons, and they're getting a lot of surface water flooding. And a lot of the wells in Madagascar, because they never had this before, the wells were just open, and they would dip to drop a bucket down. They weren't closed over and sealed. And now when they get surface water flooding, of course the wells get contaminated. So that's a climate change action now, is to convert those open wells to closed boreholes. And so we're trying to get a methodology developed to enable us to present that as an adaptation project. Okay, gentleman at the back, please.
Thank you. I'm from the TCP, and I'm also a meteorologist, and I'm very interested about Japan. You have the adaptation business, because some country, the adaptation, lots of the research report, just only the report. And in Japan, you have the business. Just like the disaster industry in Japan, you also have lots of disasters, so you have a disaster industry. So I'm wondering, because you are from the Ministry of Economy, so how many enterprise join such as kind of adaptation business? How many from the private sector? Your government have some promotion, some funding to help to create the ecosystem or not? Yeah, how much is it?
Thank you for your question. So Japan have a lot of disasters. So we know that many Japanese companies have a technology to adapt to the disasters. But the issue right now we recognize is that many Japanese companies don't realize that their technology contributes to adaptation, because the concept of adaptation is not that familiar with all the Japanese companies. So right now we are trying to promote what is adaptation, and we are also talking to companies that that provide some kind of adaptation technologies, that your company's technology is actually adaptation business. So we are gathering all kinds of examples right now. So METI is actually is publishing a like a good practice example pamphlet of all the technology list of the adaptation businesses. So right now, we have 41 examples so far, but we are planning on collecting more examples, and I think we are going to add 20 examples more this year. So, and we are going to keep on updating this pamphlet and expand the technology list that you can find in Japan.
Thank you. Let me adopt my moderator's prerogative and ask Sophie a question. So, following on from that, I mean, how many or so what, when you start to work with a local government, do you find that there's a lot of adaptation activities actually taking place, but not identified, not recognized as adaptation? Are there lots of things that they're already doing that you're able to kind of build on, or are you having to start from scratch and kind of, you know, educate the local governments about adaptation needs from the outset?
Yeah, I don't think we start from scratch, but what we do is we look at the baseline, perhaps not so much of the past investment, but we look at the baseline in terms of their capacities, how they understand the risk, what's their awareness, whether it's integrated in their plans, in the annual investment plan. So we do look at that so that we can help them integrate better the risks. But yes, I think they do a lot already, somehow without realizing. So there is and what we also think is that by adding this additional capacity building, awareness, giving them climate information, we think that it's possible that they will use the extra grant that they get, but also start influencing the other revenues that they have. And that could also be measured in part as climate finance, those other transfers. So if it's in a country where they have other transfers, perhaps eventually you could consider that 25%. After a few years of having been incentivized and sensitized, equipped with information, that could become climate finance if you think about Article 2.1c, is it? Mm-hmm. And so that's something that we don't discuss much, but that's part of, you know, how we also see this climate finance influence the bigger picture. And while I speak, perhaps there are other questions, but I'd be interested to see how these technologies are promoted, because in the portfolio that we have with, you know, those hundreds of local governments, clearly boreholes, you know, come often. And, you know, the question of maintenance is a regular one. So how are you promoting, I mean, this company or others? Of course, we'll look at your information, but how do we make this pay as you fetch available not only in that place in Uganda, but to all the districts in Uganda, to all the, you know, communes in Niger? How do we, you know, really ensure that technology transfer? That would be of great interest. And I think would be interested to explore that. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Samuel Gala, also a member of roster of experts for ABN. My question is on the selections of the local governments you work with. I see you have 26 countries in Africa. What are the criteria you use? Is it based on requests by the government? Is it based on projects that have been identified in those local governments that you support? And I saw the framework you also, the criteria for you know, for those projects kind of. Does it have anything like a benefit to, apart from the grant that you give to them, that accrue also back to the government themselves in accounting for the adaptation component and communication? Just similarly to what Gareth presented on the certified adaptation benefit. Thank you.
So the first, perhaps, you know, 5-10 countries where we worked, it's UNCDF that approached them because we wanted to pilot this particular instrument. But all the ones you see now, especially the ones in blue or the one in phase 1, they came to us to ask that we help them establish this, you know, financing system. So we work on demand from central government, more and more from ministries in charge of climate change, as they see the importance of, you know, localizing their NDC or their NAP. So we, as far as the local governments are concerned, we try to use climate risk assessment. So ranking, if we have that information, all the districts, for example, according to the risk, according to various types of hazards. And then we also look at, you know, programmatic synergies or other criteria. Sometimes donor funding also have, you know, priorities, but we try to make it objective to start, you know, in districts that are at higher risk, but also have certain level of capacities to access the grant. For example, you know, good audits. So we will check, you know, those criteria to then come with a long list and short list. But eventually the plan is to go to as many, you know, local governments as possible in a country, and perhaps, you know, eventually the whole country, if that grant window is well established. Now we do work with a number of countries on linking this particular financing mechanism, which also includes planning and investment. It's, you know, the whole definition of vertical integration of the NDC and the NAP, to link that back to the MRV system of the NDC and the NAP, so that the countries can indeed report on what they're doing with this particular, you know, modality, delivery modality. So we have done some technical assistance work on that in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, or other countries where they see indeed this as a way to then report. And if eventually we can prove that a portion of other grants that local governments get become climate finance, then the country can also report on their domestic resources. So that we haven't done, but that's part of the vision that with the climate finance, then they can influence more of their own resources and then report meaningfully, you know, on the climate additionality that they achieve. I hope that answers question.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I think that the reporting element is really important, because I don't know, I was kind of hinting, but I think there's a lot of adaptation activity going on that's not picked up. And, you know, countries are spending a lot of their own budgets on adaptation actions, but they're not reporting that under their unconditional contributions towards their adaptation and mitigation needs. And so, you know, it's not getting the, and so if you can't see what countries are spending domestically, it's harder to then go to donors and say, look, you know, we're spending 10% of our GDP on adapting to climate change. You know, we need your support to help pay for more of this, because we've got much greater adaptation needs. So I think all of this, you know, this sort of awareness raising, the ability to get better at reporting what's going on and actually demonstrate what the indicators are and what the benefits are. I think all of this will help us raise the profile of adaptation as we move forward. So any further questions? Yep, please. Mm-hmm.
To add to what you just mentioned, when I worked with the government of Eswatini, one thing that helped us with that aspect is the climate public expenditure and institutional review. So once the government does their CPR, then now you could see that there is a lot of investment that domestically they are committing to adaptation, but they're not accounting for it. So that becomes a challenge. But when we took the government through that and when they conducted that, they discovered actually the government is spending a lot on adaptation. And that exercise took us to the aspect of climate budget tagging, where all the ministries now, the line ministries, you have to tag your budget, either mitigation, adaptation, and cross-cutting. And I believe in the subsequent reporting now, they will be able to account adequately for especially the domestic resources being mobilized to address their NAP, to address their NDC under the unconditional aspect. And also, so I think as we do that, it's also good to encourage countries to undertake their climate budget tagging, which is also closely linked with the MRV, because if they don't do that, it makes MRV very, very difficult, and also accounting for what the domestic resource mobilization. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. So let me just briefly sum up. I think what we've seen here is that, you know, progress on adaptation is alive and kicking. You know, I mean, I think we are starting to make ground on identifying, you know, what adaptation is and how we present it, frame it, and mobilize resources for it. And I think that we've seen, you know, a real example of applying a logical framework in a project from Haruna, showing how the you know, the inputs and outputs are linked and so on, which is critically important, because I think, as we've just been saying, this helps us identify what adaptation is and start putting funding against it and identifying the costs, which will help us move forward to demonstrate, you know, how much money is being spent on adaptation and sort of what additional things we need. I think that, you know, the logical framework seems to me to be the, you know, an extremely powerful tool to help us identify cheap and easy ways of monitoring and reporting adaptation and not getting bogged down in heavy methodologies, sort of impact assessments in year 5 or year 10 to prove what the results are. I think we have the opportunity to show very quickly that we can deliver outcomes and outputs that we're highly confident will lead to long-term impacts and therefore benefits. Okay, some might fail, but that doesn't matter because we're using this process to report contributions towards adaptation needs. We're not using it to create emission reduction certificates that are used to meet legal compliance and legal obligations in other countries. And so we don't need to get bogged down in really heavy monitoring, reporting, and verification for adaptation work. And I think that's a real advantage that we can use to try to accelerate and scale up funding for adaptation. So with that, let me thank our 2 presenters for coming, their presentations, answering questions, and thank the audience for coming and for your participation. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much. Oh.